I'm very happy to welcome our last speaker of the evening. So Mark Lee Hunter mentioned the pharmaceutical industry, and that's one of the topics that Mary Beth Pfeiffer, have I said your name correctly, has investigated while working for the Poughkeepsie Journal, which is a a regional daily newspaper in a part of New York State. She's done many investigative reports for which she's won numerous awards. She brought out a book about how, correct me if I'm wrong, how in prisons mentally ill people are treated. She's done investigations about drug addiction in terms of pharmaceuticals, I believe, if that's correct. And also big studies on Lyme disease, as Rob Maroldi mentioned. And she has many stories to tell you about her experience on the regional level of exposing corruption. She did some reports on police using stun guns, for example. So investigating police, investigating hospitals, I suppose, investigating prisons. And she'll talk to you about how the regional impact can go way beyond the region. So please give a warm welcome to Mary Beth Pfeiffer.
I thought I'd never get up here. They saved the best for last. No offense to my other compatriots. I'm glad to be here. I am an investigative reporter. Those are words that I dearly love to say, especially at cocktail parties and so forth, because people find it very interesting. And one of the first questions I get is, do you ever feel threatened or in physical danger? And I always sort of think it's a strange question, and I asked Angela that question at lunch. She gave me pretty much the same answer, although the issues that she deals with are much different than the issues that I deal with. And I think the kinds of issues that I deal with might be a little bit more akin to what you may deal with if you go into reporting. So I am an investigative reporter. I'm not sure I look like one. You know, I don't wear trench coats and go into parking garages and meet sources, and I don't push microphones into people's faces and accuse them of things. I'm a grandmother. And for the most part, I'm pleasant. I'm mild-mannered. I'm very polite. I ask for information in a nice way. That's most of the time. But I am a bulldog. I'm a watchdog. When I bite into something, as Rob was saying, my husband, I don't let go easily. When people say no to me, I don't like it. And it makes me want the information even more. I'm tenacious. And these, by the way, are key qualities of an investigative reporter. This is what you need to be, how you need to work to be successful. I have the best job in journalism. I have the best job at my newspaper. And because of the possibilities and the reach of the internet, I'm doing it at one of the best times in history, I think. I work at a small newspaper in New York. My newspaper only has prints about 30,000 copies a day. It's in a small city. But my reach is much further than just those paper copies, and that isn't even a way that we should be measuring a newspaper's reach anymore. In terms of how many copies it publishes because of the internet. But while I work in one of the best times in journalism history, it's also one of the most difficult times, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Newspapers have lost readers, they've lost advertising. The internet, while a blessing for me as a reporter, has also so splintered our market. We are competing for the very precious time of our readers. And it means we have to be better at what we do. We have to be smart about what we do. And I think investigative reporting fits really neatly into that picture that I just painted right now, because it's something that is needed more than ever. And it's what's going to make us really valuable to our readers. So we're going to go over all that, what investigative reporting is, how we build stories, how the media is changing for the better and the worst and very fast, and how we're going to talk a little bit also about how the technology can work for you and how I use it in my reporting. But I'm going to start small and build from there. And what I'm going to show you here is a story. That's what we do. We tell stories, as Mark said. And this is a very old story, and it was written when I was a young reporter. I think it's 1978, which would be about 36 years ago. My God. I was very young when I went into journalism, straight out of high school. That's a joke. But no, I have been doing this for 34 years. Anyway, this story is really my first investigative story. And it began with a very simple assignment that I had, and basically that was to cover an automobile accident. One car had crossed this grassy median in the center of the highway and was hit head-on by another car coming in the other direction. The first car had gone out of control, obviously. A 60-ish woman was driving with her 38-year-old daughter sitting next to her in the seat, and they both were killed. And a couple of days after writing this story, I went out to the scene. I saw the body on the highway and so forth. I was just a general assignment reporter. I got a call, a tip. Somebody said, these kinds of accidents happen all the time. There are no guardrails down the center median of this highway. It's a very dangerous highway. Cars go out of control, and they go into the other side of the highway, and people die. And I said, that's interesting. And I just filed it away, and a couple of months later, I had some time. So what I did was I went into the archives of our newspaper, and I started reading articles that were filed under accidents on the Staten Island Expressway. And lo and behold, I found 6 deaths had occurred within a couple of year period, as well as a number of other serious injury accidents. And I wrote a story. And basically this story had all the elements of an investigative story. I did research. I came up with evidence. I had documents. My documents were very simple, very basic. They were just newspaper articles, but they were reliable documents. And I drew conclusions. I had a voice in this story that said, people are dying on this highway because of a flaw in the highway. And then I also brought my conclusions to people in authority, and I said, what do you think about this? I didn't call them up, the monkey with the phone, and say, tell me what the story is about this highway. And that's a very good way to put it, Mark. And it was published, and 2 weeks later, the transportation authorities announced that they would spend $1 million to put guardrails down the center of the highway. Score one. All the stories that I've done have not been as easy or as quick. I've written a number of stories that have sort of dropped into a black hole, or more often played a role in what I would call this sort of very slow process of reform in society. But this story convinced me that investigative reporting was important. It was something that I could do as a young reporter, as a beginning reporter, and it could make a difference. Lives were saved because I wrote that story. It doesn't get much better than that in terms of having a job and doing a job that has meaning. So, first I would like you to, and I would encourage you to go into journalism. It is a calling. It's an important job. You play a role in society in terms of providing people with information that they need. And I would also encourage you to go into investigative reporting, because in investigative reporting, we have a couple of kind of major roles as I see it, and it's to speak for the people who don't have power, the powerless. We are their voices. We choose to do a story and say, this is what's wrong. This is what's wrong with this picture. And it's also to get angry, to get indignant on their behalf. And I'll just show you another story. For about 10 years, what I do when I start an investigative story or I take on a subject, I tend to return to it. I circle back. I revisit it. I develop it over a period of time. And I started writing about 10 years ago about people who were mentally ill in prisons. And this is one of the later stories in that series. And the series, by the way, began with a database of deaths that I obtained under the Freedom of Information law in New York State. Namely, what I got was just a list of everyone who had died in prison over a certain period of time. And there were 4 causes of death that were listed: homicide, AIDS at that time, natural, and suicide. Homicide, there were very few. There were a lot of AIDS deaths, a lot of natural deaths, and a fair number of suicides. And I guess I could have gone in a number of different directions. I could have looked at AIDS in prison, but suicides I found very interesting. Why did people go to prison and kill themselves there? What happened? And in peeling back the layers of this story, I requested information on this, of these people who had died. I submitted their names to the prison agency, and I said, give me all the records on the death of this person and that person, and so on and so forth. And the thread that emerged was that people with mental illness were going to prison all too often in our society because of breakdowns in care in the community. But once they got to prison, and it's questionable whether they should have even been there, they couldn't cope with the very rigorous rules of prison life. And they often misbehaved, they often screamed out inexplicably, they didn't follow rules. Prison is a very tense, very difficult environment, as you can expect. And what would happen is they would end up in solitary confinement units, basically the most awful form of confinement in a prison. So this is one story in that series. It's one of my later stories. But there was a key passage in the report of the death of this inmate, and he was 19 years old. And his name was Adam Wheeler. And he was in prison for a child sex offense. I don't know what the nature of it was. He didn't have a very long sentence. But I spoke to his family, and I learned that he had mental illness when he was younger. A very troubled kid, troubled home life. This is a photograph of him when he was 12. He had a family who loved him and cared about him. And this is what the report that I obtained under New York State's Freedom of Information law said. Adam Wheeler received grossly inadequate mental health treatment characterized by a nearly complete breakdown in care. Had Adam Wheeler received adequate and appropriate mental health care and treatment, his death may have been prevented. I mentioned your job being to get mad, to get angry. And an investigative reporter gets angry when she reads something like that in an official report. We hold government accountable. No one else told Adam Wheeler's story. There were no reports of his death when he committed suicide. An investigative reporter tells that story and decides that it is a legitimate story for inquiry. Decides that there's something wrong with this picture. And that's what I did with Adam Wheeler. Another group, a very different group that I've written about, and this sort of will bring us into the more modern age of journalism that I've alluded to, is victims of Lyme disease. And I'm just going to call out one of my Lyme stories. Lyme disease is a really, it's just fraught with many, many different issues. And when I began writing about Lyme disease, I had set out to write one story and ended up writing another story entirely, which happens. My first story, and I guess my hypothesis, so to speak, was that there was no Lyme disease vaccine for people. There was one for dogs, and that there were financial forces that had forced it off the market because basically pharmaceutical companies were afraid of being sued, and there had been some physical problems that people had in the trials for the Lyme disease vaccine, and I just wanted to find out what those forces were and why we didn't have a vaccine. I never wrote that story. What I found instead was that there was a whole community of people out there who were suffering with Lyme disease, who couldn't get care for their Lyme disease, whose test results were not reliable, and there was a whole school of medicine that was saying that Lyme disease can be a chronic disease. It can recur. It needs longer courses of antibiotic treatment, and it's a much more serious problem than our government has made it out to be. And this is significant here in Europe too, because you have Lyme disease, but also because the US Centers for Disease Control tends to set the agenda for treatment of many major diseases around the world. It's something I would urge you, therefore, to look into. But the other the other point I wanted to make with this is, as I said, I work in a very small newspaper, 30,000 circulation. Yet I'm known across the United States and in many other countries for my Lyme disease reports. I have Twitter groups in the UK and in Netherlands who regularly retweet me. I got 5,000 hits on an Australian website for one of my Lyme disease stories. My Lyme stories get among the most hits on the Poughkeepsie Journal's website. But even better than that, I'm glad that they go around the world. They're read all across New York State, and they're read by legislators and opinion leaders. And the New York State legislature passed a law last spring to basically protect doctors who treat Lyme disease in alternative ways, in ways that are not generally accepted. And the Poughkeepsie Journal was, largely credited for making that happen. So I think it just kind of shows the impact of the internet in terms of allowing you to do things that you might not otherwise be able to do as a reporter at a small newspaper. I just want to kind of segue a little bit into what I think a huge fear of young reporters is, and that is, where do I get my stories? Do they just drop out of the sky? What's a database? How does it work? What do I do with it? And again, you start small. And I just sort of have a little hit list of things that, as a young reporter, I would suggest that you do. It's things that I always did to kind of build into investigative reporting. I've only been a full-time investigative reporter perhaps for the last 12 years or so. I spent a lot of time doing a lot of other stuff, but always had at least one investigative story working. Even as I was making my daily deadlines, I was putting out requests for information under the Freedom of Information law. Do that early and often. It's very easy these days, as Angela was saying. There are open record laws that I looked up. You went over that. I was going to do that. But in every country, you have a right of access in Belgium. So file requests, ask for things, go on fishing expeditions. If you don't know what to ask for, read what other reporters have written. See what their investigative reports are based on. Read the newspaper to get ideas on stories. Ask for reports that may not exist, but they'll come back with something else. I want every report on people who committed suicide in prison. That's a pretty broad request, but they might narrow it for you. Collect statistics. I always loved working with statistics as a young reporter. You see what the trends are in crime, in accidents, in prison populations, in dropout rates. You get ideas for stories that way, and things to look at and to investigate. I'd also suggest reading reports of non-governmental organizations. A lot of them do what is essentially investigative reporting. They look into they have an agenda, of course, but they look into a problem in society and they try and identify what the causes of it are and to suggest solutions. You can use what they've done, maybe not, you're not going to copy what they've done, but you do your own investigation. You look at it from your point of view. And then, as I said, read the best news outlets, see what they're reporting. As Rob said, join investigative reporters and editors or similar organizations because they exist to give you a lot of support and help with your reports. I guess there are basically, for me, two essential tools. I'm going to use that term loosely in my reporting, and that's documents and databases. That's my evidence. That's what I use to make my case. I just wrote a story about an epidemic of painkiller addiction in New York State that's going on now. One that was basically caused by the pharmaceutical industry working with doctors to encourage them to prescribe opiate, that means, made from the poppy flower, based drugs. And many, many Americans have been prescribed these and are becoming addicted and are dying. So what I did as part of that story, I wanted to know, are doctors being held accountable? My thesis, my hypothesis going into this was that the agency that exists in New York State to monitor the doctors, to make sure that doctors do their jobs and don't hurt people. First, do no harm is the mantra of medicine, wasn't doing its job. That was my feeling. That was my hypothesis. So I asked for every report of doctors who had been disciplined or otherwise punished in New York State over a 5-year period. And in this 5-year period, 8,000 people died of overdose deaths in New York State, about 4,000 of them from prescription drugs. And that is maybe 4 times as many as died from prescription drug overdoses about 10 years ago. So huge, huge increase. So 8,000 deaths, 4,000 from prescription drug overdoses. I get back 180 files. I have to read every single one of them. Investigative reporting is a lot of work. Takes a lot of time. I had interns, though, which helped a lot. And I found out that 32 doctors were disciplined and only 4 lost their licenses. So the numbers were just, very, very small of doctors being held accountable. And then I presented my information to various people, experts in medicine, experts in doctors' oversight. And they said, yeah, you're right. There are many, many deaths and very few doctors being held accountable. So documents, databases, this is what I want. I want it in black and white. The other thing, the other tool that a modern investigative reporter needs are computer programs. Excel and Access are 2 of the main tools, computer programs that I use. You've used any of these? Has anybody used Excel? No? Yeah, okay. Access is a little bit more sophisticated in terms of what it can do. You'll notice, though, I can take 1 million records and analyze them in Microsoft Access, and I can't master PowerPoint because it's not something I use to do my job. My time is so precious; it all goes into my reporting. So anyway, I would really suggest getting to know Excel, getting to know Access, or some similar kind of database analysis program. I use them regularly. And just for my third part, I'm just going to talk about this new age of journalism a little bit. Where's that? Did we bookmark that? And what I'm going to do is show you a very recent story that I wrote as part of this Painkiller series. It's not the story about the doctors that ran about 2 weeks ago. This is my latest, one of my latest stories. And notice I'm not showing you the paper anymore. I'm showing you the website because that's where all this is going. And we have this beautiful long-form kind of magazine presentation that we just started a couple of months ago. But this is a story about 63 people who died of drug overdoses in my county in 2013. In the early 2000s, I think the numbers were like 3 people a year, 5 people a year, maybe a dozen. And last year we had 63. So what I did, what I set out to do, was to put a face on this number. Who were these people? And I luckily had one of those sources who dropped in my lap a list of these people with their age, with their race, with their the drugs that were in their system when they died. It was the most wonderful gift I could have gotten. Because the authorities don't want to release the names of people who die in this way. It's considered a private death. It's not like a public accident or something like that, or a murder. So they just don't give out that information. So I was lucky to get it. And what I did was, and I was very proud of this story. I told their story, and I told it in a voice that was filled with emotion and filled with indignation, and which said, this is wrong, what's happening in our state and in our country, that people are getting these addictive painkillers and that they're dying by the scores. And I'll just read you the first sentence or two because I think you're going to see right away that this is a different story, the way it's written. This is the story of a list, thick with flawed heroes and tragedy, of 63 people, the lives they never got to finish, and the reasons they died. They were mothers and fathers, the gainfully employed and not, sports and dog lovers, addicts. They all died in 2013 when they accidentally overdosed on drugs. This story resonated with readers. It's an example, I think, of where we need to go in the future with our reporting. It, as I said, was filled with emotion. It was told in a way that people could understand. At first, when I got this list, I was going to do something, the average age of these people were this, and X amount were white and X amount were black, and do sort of very straight kind of reporting on, interesting reporting certainly, but flat. So, and you'll notice that the story got 3,700 Facebook shares. Our Twitter counter was broken because it says 0 there. But that's a lot for us. Most of our stories will get 10, 20. My most recent story got 300. My stories get a lot because the investigative reports really resonate. A murder story will get a couple of hundred. But this got 3,700 Facebook shares. So that was terrific. I'll just point out a couple other things that kind of bring us into the modern age of journalism. There's a video in which I interviewed the mothers of two women who died. There are graphics where I report. I tell people the story in another way, and there, of course, is art. But I think it sort of makes the point that we just need to be better. We need to be more interesting. We need to tell stories in different ways. We actually have computer programs at the Poughkeepsie Journal today, which brings me sort of to another point, in which I can look up in real time who's reading my story, how many people are reading my story, how long on average they're reading my story for, how they were directed to my story, whether through Facebook or Twitter or a Google search, or if they just came right to poughkeepsiejournal.com. I can see whether the traffic to the website at this particular moment, on this particular day, is more or less than a week ago. And newspapers are using these computer programs all the time now. There's another computer program called Omniture. That one is called Chartbeat. That tells me how many people read my stories in the last month, or my stories in the last week, or whether I'm doing better or worse. I mean, this is how I'm judged, and this is how many reporters are judged. And while this story did well, and my stories generally are received fairly well. They not always are. Sometimes I'll have a clunker, but an important story that needs to be told. I wrote a story as part of this series. I think it got maybe 20 Facebook shares. But it was an important element of the series. I'm not going to go into all the details. But what I'm getting at is this raises the question, do we give people just what they want? Or do we give them what they need? It's these computer programs, the very rapid changes in journalism are raising questions about how we do our job, how we better serve our readers. The Poughkeepsie Journal had 280 employees about 10 years ago. It has 70 employees now. It has lost millions and millions of dollars annually in its revenue. We're fighting for our very existence. One of the things that I'm very happy for is that my job wasn't cut. Investigative reporting is seen as a very, very important part of the future and the picture of journalism. But where we're going, I can't say. There are very exciting possibilities because of the internet and all that it offers in terms of reporting possibilities as well as reach. I mean, I can get reports over the internet in 10 seconds that it used to take me a week to have mailed to me. But there's just one other thing I would like to show you, and then I'm going to wrap up. And this also demonstrates the reach of the internet. I Googled Poughkeepsie Journal, Wall Street Journal, and the word Medicaid, which is the name of a government program in New York, in the United States, basically, to pay for care for indigent people, all sorts of care. And I discovered that New York was helping itself to a lot of money that it didn't deserve to get. And the Wall Street Journal, which is a very big, very prestigious newspaper, picked up on my story. And you can see that time after time they credit the Poughkeepsie Journal. They actually held congressional hearings as a result of this. And Congress accused New York of helping itself to $15 billion that it didn't deserve. So I have my $1 million story in my first year of reporting, and I have my $15 billion story in one of my recent years. But I do credit the internet with allowing me to be heard in a way that might not have been possible previously. So anyway, that's it. I'm an investigative reporter, and I urge you to someday think about that, and I hope you can say, I'm an investigative reporter, too. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there questions for Mary Beth?
Yeah. Isn't it dangerous to bring stories in such a sensational manner? Like with those dead people in Dutchess district or county or however it's called. Is it dangerous? I mean, doesn't it cause too much of a shock amongst people when you bring it so sensationally that it almost seems like their own family has died?
I don't think so. I think we point out that this is a very serious problem. I don't think it is sensationalized to any degree that it doesn't deserve to be, emphasized, I would say. I wouldn't use the word sensationalized. These are stories that need to be told. And sometimes you do have to sort of underscore your point. And as I said, I wrote that story in a dramatic way because I wanted people to really understand how serious and how significant a problem this was.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Students? Okay, Mark. Ask another question.
Okay, why would it be sensational to reveal your emotion in the face of something terrible?
Well, it's just the way it's brought. Well, in the sense of literature, I find it really well written. As far as I've read it and heard you tell it, but it seems more to be like a story to be found in a book or in a magazine rather than in a newspaper, in which I expect more neutral stories or stories brought in more neutral ways.
Well, that's a really good point. And as I said, this was written in a much different way. Though my stories generally do have a voice, that's the job of an investigative reporter, to draw conclusions, to tell readers, there's something wrong here, and I'm going to tell you what is wrong with this picture. I make statements that say, nobody did anything to stop these doctors from prescribing these pills. I say that because I can do so based on my reporting, based on the documents. I make sure that I have the evidence to make these statements, and they are bold statements. Investigative reporters do have a voice in a story. But I think with that story, I did take a little bit of a risk and a little bit of a leap, but it was still well within the confines of my evidence and within the boundaries of kind of appropriate journalism. I think we still do have limits as to what we should say and how far we should go, and how much we should let ourselves enter into a story. But I think it was appropriate there, certainly for that subject.
Can I just ask one question to the three journalists? To the three journalists, I'm just curious, do you consider yourself, you use the word, I think, neutral? Do you know the word neutral? You don't take a position. I'm wondering if any of you consider yourselves neutral.
That is a trick question. Okay. Bob wrote a book called Objectivity and Muckraking, Journalism's Colliding Traditions. And I read that book when I was doing my doctoral thesis, and my compliments, it really influenced me, because he nailed a contradiction, which you just expressed too, which is that, when you're doing an investigation, you become an expert and you know what happened. You arrive at a point where you know more about the subject than any other source. Okay, you've gathered enough material and you make a judgment. And it's not just an American thing. Have you guys heard of Albert Londres, the French journalist? Okay, he wrote a study of the French prison colony in Cayenne in 1924. It was called Aubagne, okay, in the prison. And he takes you on a ride through hell. It's unbelievable what's going on in that place. He can hardly stand it. It's about all he can do to record what's happening around him. And he walked out of the place, and his last report was, I've finished, the government has to start. And he sets out 4 reforms. 2 of the reforms were enacted before he died, 6 years later, and the other 2 after he died. Okay, he shut the goddamn place down, and it was a place that had to close. And that is what investigation is about. It's saying something has to stop or something has been ignored that is wrong to be ignored. Okay, you're supposed to change the world on the basis of an investigation and not just a hysterical voice, just saying this is something wrong and I can prove it.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't strive so much to be objective as to be fair and fact-based. I think objectivity can be a can of worms, of something that prevents reporters from looking at the facts and making decisions. And investigative reporting, you have to make decisions. You have to say what's wrong. And, traditional interpretations of objectivity have precluded that.
Okay, objectivity, okay, as a practical fact, okay, we're talking about journalism as if it exists in a world apart. Okay, what's happening on the internet now, if you look at the different media on the internet, is that objectivity is being replaced by transparency. Okay, when you read something on the internet, in forums, if people say this camera is better than another, they always say, well, I don't work for the company that made the camera. Everybody is being forced toward transparency, and it's happening to journalists too. So it's no longer about saying I'm completely neutral and I have no emotion and I'm just looking at the facts. That's the way I was trained too. But it isn't what the audience is expecting now. They expect us to be affected by what we're seeing, but they expect us to say why we feel that way, what is, you know, the basis of the judgment we're making. And if you can prove that, you know, the judgment is right, well, I don't know, how do you feel about it?
For me, generally investigative reporting for me is really, really a passionate job. So when I get the documents and when I get the sources, I get really excited. And when I see a document which proves that the bad guy is the bad guy, I get really excited. And I am like, I want to prove that somebody is a bad guy. So maybe I'm not in a way like totally objective in that idea, but when it comes to writing a story, if I don't have proof, I cannot write whatever I want. And on the other hand, it's a different when you write a story like this, when you have people who died or people who were injured, and when you get the chance to give them the opportunity to say how they feel. For example, my colleagues from Sarajevo, some of you are going to be there, wrote a recent story which was really emotional about the children who were conceived during the war by rape. And it is a really emotional story. It's a really tough story. It's a story in which you cannot be neutral. I mean, those children are products of rape, and they know it. And in those kind of stories, you just want to say how wrong it was, and you want to give them the opportunity to say it. But in a story in which I chase a bad guy who broke the law, it's much more like I don't even know the person. I don't feel anything towards him. I don't know. I just want, as a citizen and as a journalist, to prove that he's a bad guy and that people should know that he's a bad guy. So, depending on what subject you work on, but definitely whenever you start doing an investigative story, you go into it with some idea that you are going to prove somebody does something bad. So you are not neutral at the beginning. So that's my...
There's a famous quote from, can you hear me? There's a famous quote from an American journalist, Edward R. Murrow, and he walked into the German concentration camp at Buchenwald, and he was the first group of American soldiers and reporters to enter, and he saw piles of dead, murdered Jews, and he turned and said, on some stories, there's only one side. And it's good to understand that sometimes you see terrible things, and your job is really not to try to present the other side, because there is only one side sometimes. And that's a big decision to make. And as a young journalist, be careful about making that. But there are times when there is no other defensible side, and we can then try to show what that story is.
Can we, before we plant the seeds in the head of the freshman?
Yes.
We are talking about dangerous stuff here, because
I agree.
Because when you talk about objectivity, I think it's very, very important that we tell them that objectivity is a goal, can be a goal. When you say transparency, it's true. You have to say what your goals are when you write a story, when you want to put a focus on a topic. Please don't say that objectivity is the opposite of subjectivity. Because, can I finish? Because it's what I see way too often in today's papers and on the news is that it's all about me, 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 me. It has to be about the topic. So as a reader, I really don't care so much about what the journalist is thinking about something. I care about the facts, and I'm old enough, adult enough to think and form my own opinion. I do agree that you have to be transparent, but what I see today is that it's all about the branding, we talked about it during the lunch. It's all about the personality of the journalist, and the focus is too much on the journalist instead of on the news, on the topic.
No, listen, the biggest ethical flaw you can make in investigative journalism is to take the place of the victim. It's not, I'm showing you someone who is suffering. It's like, oh, how it hurts me to see this person suffering. Okay? I mean, that happens all the time, and it's horrible, okay? I agree completely. But, you know, back to this thing about objectivity and subjectivity. The objectivity is that you're objective toward the facts. You get all the facts and you deal with them whether you like them or not. If you find out that he's not a bad guy, you don't say he's a bad guy even if you hate his guts. Okay, if he is a bad guy, you say so even if you just had dinner with his cousin and you thought, wow, I like the cousin, well, there goes my date Saturday night, okay? You respect the facts of the situation, but in the end, Mary Beth is right. You make a judgment. You say, this should not have happened. Okay, yeah.
Okay, just really quickly, I think what Tom is saying is that young journalists need to practice objectivity of a form. They need to consider both sides of the issue and not take the kinds of liberties that you take later in investigative reporting. You have to have a lot of experience and you have to spend a long time on each story.
I think it's something you should be practicing from the start. You should be learning how to do it, and I think that's what professors are. To tell them they've gone too far, at times they're not far enough. Okay, I mean, that's what a coach is for. Okay, this is a thing about pedagogical stuff, but the single most important thing about investigative journalism is that it's an apprenticeship. Okay, Angela is working with Drew Sullivan, who's one of the best editors on the planet right now. Okay, I work with great editors. Okay, you work with people who help you form your judgment. That's what it's about. Okay, you shouldn't have to make all these decisions alone. It's too heavy, especially at the start of your career. You can get really nervous about this.
Okay, we're going to end on that note. I wish we had more time because it's really getting interesting now.